Welcome to the MIT Faculty Forum Online, a program of the MIT Alumni Association. I'm Joe McGonegal, Director of Alumni Education, and will serve as moderator. Please help us make this as interactive a platform as possible by submitting your questions through our online platform for our guest, Professor Sharone. If you want to ask a question, enter your first name, location, and question, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. If you're on Twitter and you wish to, you can use the hashtag MITFaculty to make comments, but please restrict your questions to submitting them through the platform. I'm joined today by Ofer Sharone, the Mitsubishi Career Development Professor and the Assistant Professor of Work and Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Professor Sharone, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And if you'd start off by giving us a broad overview of your work before we ask some questions.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So let me start by discussing long-term unemployment, which has been the focus of my research, and situating us a little bit historically of where we are on this issue. The news lately has been pretty positive with job growth, and it may give us the sense that the issue of long-term unemployment is also kind of back to normal. But that would be a mistaken conclusion. If we look at trajectory, if you go back to 1948, as this graph shows you, we are really at extreme crisis levels still from the Great Recession in terms of the percent of the unemployed who are long-term unemployed. So yes, we are seeing some improvement in the last couple of years, but we are still at levels that are way above historical averages, and the improvement is happening much too slowly. There are still millions of Americans, talented, eager to work, who are not able to participate in the job market. Let me show you a few more numbers just to contextualize this crisis and to show that we're not back to normal, which means we need to worry about this. You can see the number of unemployed who are long-term unemployed is still, it's more than double what it was back in 2007. The percent of the unemployed who are long-term unemployed also doubling, almost double. And then there are these other more invisible kind of numbers. This doesn't show up on any of the unemployment rate numbers, but we have what's called missing workers. This is an estimate crunched by the National Employment Law Project using BLS data. These are workers that, after accounting for the aging of our society and retirements, we still would expect to be in the workforce, looking for work or working, but yet they're not. So we've gone from 400,000 to 6.3 million. So this is an astonishing growth of workers that are missing. In many cases, they are discouraged workers. And I'll talk a little bit more, and I think later in our discussion, about why there may be particularly intense discouragement among American workers. We can also see the average duration of looking for work double. The number of people who are part-time jobs who want to be in full-time jobs, so they're involuntarily part-time, almost double. So on all these criteria, we can see we're not yet back to normal. Now, the focus of my research has been on the toll of long-term unemployment. This is my book that came out a year ago, Flawed System, Flawed Self, that really focuses on the experience of white-collar professionals. And the flawed self part is the part that's referring to the typical American white-collar experience, when people come to feel like something is wrong with me. It's a feeling expressed to me over and over when I do in-depth interviews. It's one of the most painful parts of being unemployed, and it's devastating to the individual in a way that's not really captured usually by the numbers and the statistics. So I'll just give you one quote that's really typical of what people would say. Christopher, the hardest thing is esteem, confidence. It's killed. I've turned into an introvert. I feel like I've gotten older. This is what typically happens after 6 months, 8 months of being out in the job market. After having a very successful career, in most cases, these are people who are professionals, college educated. I have some MIT alums who I've supported, who have researched in this condition, people with PhDs. But after months and months of basically getting shut out of the labor market, this is a typical subjective response. And this leads to job search discouragement. It's not only because people's prospects don't seem, they lose hope. It's not only the loss of hope. It becomes actually very painful to continue searching. And I'll get more into that later. It also, I think, helps us understand why we don't see much political mobilization around this issue. So if you think back to the Great Depression, the last time we had this kind of crisis, we had millions of people out in the streets demanding that some action be taken to address this crisis. We don't see it today. I think in part it's because people have really privatized the issue, understand it as something about them. So why do we have this crisis? I'm going to just highlight a couple of factors that I think are important in addition to the economy. And the economy has been improving. And so why are we not seeing a decline in long-term employment that's proportionate to the improvement in jobs? One reason I already discussed, that the emotional toll, the self-blame really makes it very hard to be the most effective job seeker that you can be. Job searching requires very intense interactive kind of activities. It's hard when you're feeling really bad about yourself, and this is why support becomes essential, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other piece is long-term unemployment discrimination and age discrimination. So age discrimination is something I think we're pretty well aware of. There's laws on the books. They're hard to enforce, but I think there's a lot of awareness of this problem. Long-term unemployment discrimination is one that we're only recently becoming very aware of and is a major issue. So let me just tell you about one study. A couple of years ago, a colleague from Northeastern, Rand Gayad, did an audit study where he sent out resumes that, in response to employer postings, that were identical in every respect except he changed two things. One is how long the person's unemployed, and two, whether there is a match between their experience and what the employer is looking for. And it turned out that people who had the right match in experience but were 6 months unemployed or more were far less likely to get an interview than people with no relevant experience but only 3 months unemployed. I found this shocking. I think it's irrational. It's not helpful to the employers. It's obviously really hurtful to the job seekers. This also caught the attention of the White House. They have been doing their best to try to deal with it, but there's only so much that they can do without legislation. And this really requires the cooperation of the employer community as well. So this is a part of the story. So what can be done? This is the more hopeful part. So with the coming out of my book last year, I was actually approached by Boston-based career coaches and counselors who said, we hear you, we recognize there's this crisis, we want to do something to help. Usually the clients that can come to private practitioners are ones who can afford to pay them, and they're not these long-term unemployed. And my book is also critical of some practices of support, and they said, we want to learn how to do it better. So I said, well, let's work together. If you're willing to work pro bono, I will match you with people who are long-term unemployed. We will provide direct service to people who really need it, and then we'll also learn through the process. I will track what you do, what works, so that we can learn how to best support this group. So we did this last year. We're doing it again this year. We have very encouraging results from last year, which is of the 100 people we supported, 30% of them actually got good jobs, either full-time job or long-term contract position of over 3 months. And you can see that 30% compares to 18% of the same self-select group who came to us but who we didn't have capacity to support. We followed them anyway. And you can see that it's almost double the rate at which people can get jobs if they're supported. And I believe that's a lot because of the kind of emotional support that's provided and the strategic support about how do you get around some of these obstacles. So 30% is not perfect, right? There's still these employment discrimination, stigmas that are not overcome by coaching, but it helps. And you can really see that it helps a lot with this perception something is wrong with me. So prior to the support, 61% of them agreed with that statement. These are the long-term unemployed job seekers. But after support, the control group that did not receive any support, it increased to 84, while those we supported, it decreased. So we were on the right track of changing that perception. I think a lot of why they were more effective is this understanding that it's not just about them, that there's others in the same boat, that it helps counter the discourse that there's something wrong with me, and it mediates the experience of job search, so it's not just a black hole where you're sitting at home and getting no response. You now have someone to check in with, get feedback, and feel like you're on a trajectory of improving how you're going about the search. So last thing I'll say in this kind of introductory remarks is that our next steps is to try to scale this Institute for Career Transitions to make this support available nationally. We were in Boston. We're still focused in Boston. In order to go beyond what we're currently doing, we can't strictly rely on volunteers. We need to be able to pay, at least subsidize some of the coaches. So we are actually in the process of becoming a nonprofit. If anybody out there has ideas about how to raise funds for this kind of venture, I am all ears. This is not something I have a lot of experience with. I'm more of a researcher, but there is great need to provide support to this population. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can just take it deeper in the conversation.
Sure, and we've got questions coming in already. But I'm curious, you go back to this System Flawed Self book came out last year, and looking into this book, I noticed you did not write it from your office at Sloan. You infiltrated these, both in Israel and in San Francisco, these job support agencies for the long-term unemployed. That must have been a lengthy process. Did it start before or during the recession? Was it inspired by it? Did it happen afterwards?
So this started actually 10 years ago. This is a very long project. When you talk about infiltrating these organizations, I did become a full participant in job search support groups. And then I did in-depth interviews where I sit down with people, open-ended questions, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours. Tell me about what your experience has been. That's the only way to get beneath the numbers, right? So we have a ton of numbers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does a great job telling us month to month how many millions are unemployed and for how many weeks. We have no idea what that experience is actually like, what the obstacles experienced are, and that will help us think about how do we overcome those obstacles, how do we support. So this kind of very time-consuming qualitative research is essential for understanding what's behind the numbers. I started this research before the Great Recession because we also had a good idea that this is a problem. It dates back to the 1970s, particularly of white-collar unemployment. So we've always known about unemployment, but we tend to think of it as a blue-collar, as an education issue, that if people had college degrees, the problem would be solved. What we've actually seen for the last 30 years, and it became most clear in the Great Recession to many more people, is that once you're unemployed, the chances of becoming long-term unemployed are actually no different for those with a college degree, with a high school degree, with a PhD. If anything, those with higher levels, with PhDs, based on our small sample, they have a higher rate of becoming trapped in long-term unemployment. The vulnerabilities to things like perceived overqualification become bigger barriers. So education is not a panacea here. Of course, it can deal with some of the problem for some subset, but it goes beyond education, and this is why I'm talking about these two other really important issues, which is the toll it takes on the job seeker, and what kind of support can help maintain and sustain a job search. And then employer practices that in some cases using applicant tracking systems, using automated screen out techniques can really just shut out millions of long-term unemployed job seekers, and that is a real problem.
You talk about Americans experiencing what you call self-subjectification. That tell me if I've got it right. Your chemistry's all off with the employer, and it's your fault, and there's little you can do about it other than self-improvement. And so self-help has been aligned much with the rise of, or the rise of self-help has been aligned with the rise of white-collar long-term unemployment.
Yes, so there's a bunch of issues there. The self-subjectification, even I have a hard time. When you write an academic book, you have to throw in these kind of jargon. It's good for the peer review. But let me explain what I mean. And it came out of the comparison with Israel. So in Israel, what really matters when you're job searching are your objective skills, your credentials, your very specific experiences. And people feel like I'm just reduced to this work object. I can't express anything about who I am, but I just have to turn myself into like a computer with specs, you know? Now, in the American case, we have a very different hiring system, for good and bad. We have a hiring system that deeply relies on rapport, on interpersonal chemistry. It begins with networking. Every coach, counselor book on job searching will tell you that, and with some research to support this, that it's very hard to get a job simply applying online with no intermediary, no referral, right? So networking, what is that about? That's about being able to not only present, you don't call someone or approach someone and say, I am a great accountant and here are the 10 skills I have. What you actually have to do is, you can mention that, but you have to create a connection. The person has to feel like, wow, you're the kind of person we want in our company. You're the kind of person I want to be working with. We share something we have a human connection that goes beyond your skills. This is also a key in interviews. In the American interview, many job seekers describe it as it's like a first date. You're there partly to, for the objective stuff, but you're there to see if there's chemistry. Okay. The issue with this, the special vulnerability this creates for people who are long-term unemployed is that they feel that the hiring system is putting them on the line every time they apply for a job. Their self is getting evaluated, not just their skills. And to some extent, they're correct in perceiving this. This is how hiring works here. We're not simply hiring a list of specs. When you're being evaluated on these intangibles, on the self behind the skills, and you get rejected, and rejected, and rejected, it follows that you start questioning, well, maybe it's something about me. Maybe there's something wrong with me. This is where that sentiment keeps coming from. And this is why it's crucial that the support provided to job seekers, I don't think we're going to change the hiring system, but I think we can make headway on the support we provide to job seekers. First and foremost, acknowledge that this is a real issue, explain the vulnerability to it, explain the larger context that it's not just all about you, it's partly about you. There's also a crisis that's way beyond you and it's historical. But there are techniques we are developing to create some distance between the sense of self and the self as presented to the employer, so that it's more possible to sustain and endure a job search that will typically take at least months, if not years, particularly for people who are more skilled and educated.
I was curious about the results of your pilot, and it was small, your pilot so far, project on telling one subset of people that's not the case, right? That's not necessarily true about you, that you do have the ability, there's other forces at work and so forth. I was worried about that other set at first when I read it, that they were told, we're going to follow you instead of helping you. But it was just a matter of you lacking the number of coaches for them in the end. But they still played along, I guess.
Look, to be able to say anything about the effective support, we need a control group. Mm-hmm. And a control group that comes from the same type of people who are seeking support. Otherwise, we are left with questions about, well, maybe your data just reflects these self-select people who came to you for support. So we had 800 people sign up to get support because we offered it for free. And we said that we're offering good support. We've vetted the people providing it. Now, we don't have the capacity to help 800 people, unfortunately. I hope in the future we can help, hundreds of thousands who need it. At this point, we were able to help 100 last year and about the same number this year. So of the others who we couldn't support, some of them we said, we're really sorry, we hope to support you in the future, but your participation in the research would really help us a lot. So if you participate in the surveys and in our interviews, we can pay you. And we did pay the control group, and that's how we could track what happened to the same type of people who would have been supported, but just randomly were not selected, and we could see the difference.
Good. I want to get to some questions coming in here. We've got one from John in New York, says, is it really age discrimination or perhaps skill sets not being up to date? And in a related note, he says, do you have any advice for older workers who fear they may lose their jobs before they're ready to leave the workforce?
So on the first part, this is a complex phenomenon. And yes, of course, there are cases where skill sets don't keep up. And then there is a skills mismatch between what the employer needs and what the employee has. The case that, though, I went into great detail about that one study, illustrates, though, that it's not just about skills, right? So in the study that Rand Gaya did, we had someone with, on paper, at least all the indications that they are very likely possessing the right skills, and yet someone with no indication of possessing the right skills was preferred simply on the basis of long-term unemployment. So now that's a way, these audit studies are a way to kind of clarify that there is something beyond just skills that employers are assessing here. And in this case, long-term employment is one of them. Similar studies have been done with age, where you vary skills and you vary the age of the applicant, and you can code the age by what year you graduated, for example. And we see that the response, how often you're invited to interviews, decreases with every decade of age. And there's nothing in those resumes that suggest skill set is declining, right? So it's not that skill set is never an issue. It's just that it's not the only issue, and that age and duration of unemployment are also important factors, and ones that I think are particularly disturbing to us, right? So if the skill set is not there, I think we can live with that, okay, go get retraining, get the right skills, and then reapply. It makes sense. But if it's strictly based on employer biases about, this person's been out of work 6 months, therefore I'm not even going to look, or this person is 58, therefore I'm not going to look, I think that should be something that, as citizens, as people who can influence the business world, we should be talking about, and we should be thinking about how to avoid those situations. People not losing their job is a really, it's a difficult issue. We're living in an economy with ever higher churn, where the rate of tenure, the number of years you can expect to be in a job, is decreasing dramatically over the last 3 decades. I don't really know if there's any general advice about how to buffer yourself against that churn in the economy, I do think that it's useful for people to think strategically about how am I positioning myself for a potential next job. Are the skills that I'm using in this job marketable? If not, maybe I can include in what I'm currently doing a set of tasks that if I lose this job, I will have highly marketable skills to offer to the next employer. So this is more kind of protection through becoming more employable. Because I don't know what you could do really systematically to avoid those other risks.
And nowadays, there's the shoring up of the LinkedIn profile. It's not that you get out your resume when you lose your job, brush it up, and start all over again. There's this constant maintenance that you talk about in the book, how Americans view a resume as an advertisement. Israelis and maybe some other cultures are still doing that bulleted list that Americans might have had 50 years ago, but not today, right?
Right. So this goes back to the American chemistry game versus the way hiring happens in other places. And my research was in Israel, but I have a good sense from talking to researchers that this is also the case in Europe and to some extent in China. Our resume is just the tip of the iceberg. So we spend a lot of time compared to other cultures perfecting the aesthetics of our resume. Every word needs to be perfect. And why is that? It's because we know that people are trying to read between the lines to see what kind of person we are, not just what skills we have. Is this the right cultural fit, the right interpersonal fit? Cover letters are even a more clear example of that. Like in Israel, the cover letter is, attach, please find the resume. And the resume is a list. In the US, the cover letter is even more of an opportunity to disclose, reveal the part of yourself that you think will be the right match for this organization. So people spend, sometimes a couple of weeks researching, doing informational interviews, understanding the culture of the targeted employer, and then writing a cover letter that is very personalized, showing how, essentially you were born for this organization and you would be the perfect fit. And the same thing is with interviews and with the style of networking. So these are results of different styles of practices of hiring, which in turn mean different practices of job search, which in turn mean different experiences of unemployment.
It's very rich terrain for a sociologist to
Yes.
to work on. Yeah. Question from Bill, West Hartford. Bill says, is this a company problem with bias and ability to make employees with the necessary skills, or is it a problem of people with insufficient skills who can't make the educational leap? I guess he means is long-term unemployment being the problem there.
Okay, in my view, it's a problem for the individuals who are unemployed, but it's also a problem for businesses who are missing out on the best talent. I think that we are blinded as employers, as organizations, to the qualifications of millions of people based on stigmatized, stereotypical understandings of who becomes long-term unemployed. I think the reality of long-term unemployment that exists today doesn't match our I think in many ways, kind of unconscious schemas of who is a person who's long-term unemployed. We think long-term unemployed, we think someone who is not very educated, maybe in some ways just a cultural misfit. I'm not sure exactly, and it probably varies, but there is something that's triggered. When we think long-term unemployed, we think probably someone that I should not consider. And that does not match the reality of millions of people who lost their job in a down economy a few years ago, happened to not get rehired within a few months, in many ways for random reasons, for reasons of not having the right connection at the right time, and now are trapped because of the perception of, wow, you're long-term unemployed. So the businesses are missing out on this talent, and I think it's also a social problem. It's a problem we should think of as citizens, as people in a society where we want to create an open, fair, meritocratic economy that gives opportunities to people who have the skill and talent and who want to use them. A system of hiring that creates these sorts of obstacles, I don't think are consistent with what most of us think as a fair, meritocratic system. So that's what I want to put out there.
Question about H-1B visas versus O-1 visas. I don't know if you know all the technicalities of them, but Gregory from New York says, I believe it's easier and less expensive to find someone in the global market who's already working in my field rather than spend a few months bringing somebody already practicing up to speed. If there was really a shortage of special skills, why don't companies bring more people in under that O-1 program that has no limits?
Yeah, so I have to first of all admit I'm not at all an expert on these types of visas. The claims of a skills shortage is one that's highly debated, and whether it exists or not. Some of my colleagues at Sloan have shown that the percent of industries that really are experiencing skill shortage is around 25%, as opposed to claims that are often made in the media that paint it as more like 80%. And we can also see that there isn't a whole lot of the kind of the rising wages that you would expect with a shortage, a skills shortage. So there may be highly specialized areas where there is a skills shortage, where it may be much harder to find someone locally than someone abroad. I don't think that's the big picture of what's happening.
For 4 million Americans.
Yes, I don't think that's the 4 million person issue. It may be a small subset of it.
Tom in Tulsa says, do you believe that the outsourcing of human resource functions, particularly staffing, has contributed to the challenges of the long-term unemployed?
I do. So there has been, this is a much longer historical change. We used to invest a lot more in human resources. Peter Capelli at Wharton writes a lot about this. Human resource departments used to have much more of a role in the recruitment process and the hiring and the vetting, and had professionalized processes for evaluating right fits. Today we rely more on informal referrals. You know, the hiring manager gets an email from someone they trust saying, hey, check out Joe, he seems pretty good, right? And then the hiring manager will do an interview, and we study, there's a lot of research on how did you make a hiring decision about Joe? And you know, there's a lot of answers like, I had a good gut feeling about Joe. He seemed like he'd be a good fit. This reliance on gut feeling based in interviews, or the gut feeling that starts with the network contact who had a good feeling to send the email, and then you probably shared the same gut feeling. You know, sometimes it results in the perfect match, but in many cases, it can lead us to overlook people with the right talent, with perhaps even better skills. And I think it takes more investment in HR and in recruiting, in-house.
Talent management.
Talent management to get the best talent. And when you when you outsource it, a staffing agency is simply not going to have as good an understanding of what you need. And so I do think it's a part of it.
I was surprised. Staffing agencies are all the rage in Israel and some other countries. And even high school teachers, you say, are apply through staffing agencies.
Yeah, so you know, Israel has become more American than America, is the way that some Israeli scholars
right. A lot of them
refer to
say
it.
we do it because we think America does
Yes,
it.
yes. So there is an idea that the United States is a pure meritocratic system, and that this is an Israeli, common Israeli idea that we need to become more like the United States and more strictly meritocratic. And so, of course, networking should be discouraged as much as possible because networking is understood to be highly influenced by factors like, are you my old buddy? Do I owe you a favor from some other context? Not strict merit. And staffing agencies in Israel are used in this very rigid way. But the idea is to be very meritocratic. It turns out that what they do basically is have a specs sheet of like the 30 qualifications we want, and they get into very minute levels of experience and credentials that, so the Israeli job search experience is also very frustrating in a different way than the American. Israelis feel like they're shut out of a very rigid labor market where they can't present the self behind the skills or their transferable skills or their potential. They're shut out by rigid systems. There's also testing in Israel that we don't have nearly as much of here. I'm not saying Israel is in any way the perfect model to emulate. It's a nice comparative case, though, because it shows what's distinct about the US case. And there are a lot of variations globally about how hiring happens. I think we are the outlier. And I know we have people from different countries here. I'd be really curious to hear if anyone thinks they have a hiring system that's similar to ours that relies so much on the self as revealed in the cover letter. The self is able to create rapport during networking, to get a referral, and then finally at the interview, which is kind of this first date situation where, you'll try to look at the wall. If the person is skiing, you might talk about skiing. This is advice given to job seekers that they actually take on and sometimes report as effective. I think we are different. And this form of exceptionalism, I think, is one to worry about. I think it can lead to not the best hiring decision, and it certainly affects the experience of being unemployed.
Good. Well, no questions quite yet from international location. We're still asking for that, but just a reminder to viewers that we'll broadcast until 12:45, so we've got a few more questions we can manage to get to. Patricia in Pennsylvania says managers seem to fear overqualified applicants. Should business schools teach leadership differently? For example, teaching that leaders are facilitators of talent rather than experts or power holders.
So overqualification is certainly an issue, a concern of hiring managers. It has many different flavors, and it is a difficult one for job seekers to deal with. So let me just paint the picture of you how this typically works out. Is you had a good job, you were a vice president of marketing, you lost that job. You're looking for another VP of marketing position, typically, for months. You're not able to get it. Now you say to yourself, okay, I have to be realistic. The market doesn't have so many VP of marketing positions, so I need to take a step down, and take a lower level position in marketing, one that I'm clearly very qualified for, and that I did for many years. There are many more jobs of those sorts, but there the manager is going to worry that, are you really going to be happy? Are you going to stick it out? Are you going to look for another position to change to? Now, we do have research on this, not my own, but others, that show the tenure, the rate at which people stay at jobs once they've been unemployed is actually pretty long and longer than people who just switch jobs from one employer to another. I think they are more appreciative of having a job. They typically are very, they work hard. So the overqualification fear, I think, is not founded in data, but it's a perception that becomes a real barrier. I do think that we could do a better job teaching in business schools on hiring, on the kind of cognitive biases that come in evaluating candidates, the kind of fears that typically hiring managers have. And let's talk about what's supported by data and what's not. And let's try to be as data-driven as rational about this process as we can. I think that's a job for us as business school educators to help teach a next generation of managers, but also it's really important to get the word out to people who are doing hiring now.
Good. Mark in Newton, Mass. says, what are the biggest differences in the attitudes and circumstances of older unemployed workers versus the younger unemployed?
So age, first of all, is the best predictor of whether you will become long-term unemployed. Earlier I spoke about how education level, which we typically think is the main predictor, is not really at all a predictor of long-term unemployment. But with age, with every decade of age, so if you're 30, you're more likely to be on long-term unemployed than 20. If you're 40, more than 30. It's very linear. By the time you're 60, the chances of getting trapped in long-term unemployment are much bigger. The experience, therefore, is one where for younger workers, it is often really hard to break in and to keep a job. But the market is more fluid. So they tend to get lots of jobs. The jobs may not last. They may not be the right fit. There's a lot of churn. And I'm not trying to minimize. There are clearly big social issues with young workers and young college graduates these days have a really hard time finding a good fitting job that makes use of their skills. But it's a different problem than the older worker who won't even get their foot in the door. The experience of the older worker is of months and months and months and months of applying, of attempting to network, sometimes getting interviews, and then getting rejected. And there's this complete shutout effect. What they refer to it often to me in interviews, people in this position call it the black hole. I feel like my resumes are going to a black hole. It goes in, nothing ever comes out. And this is, in terms of an emotional effect and the effect on the sense of self, devastating. And makes it hard to continue being an effective job seeker without support that helps contextualize, that helps recognize others are in the same boat. There are structural issues, there are issues in my control, there are strategies. And so I think key is to increase the level of support we provide to this group.
We just have 5 minutes left. Mike from Burlington, Vermont says, how often does the issue of the overqualified worker come up in the job search process? I think you covered that. But in the time that remains here, did I miss any? Oh, Christine from San Francisco. Sorry, Christine. You mentioned the importance of a LinkedIn profile. Can LinkedIn do anything to help combat long-term unemployment? It's a private company, of course.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if she means the job seeker using LinkedIn can help reduce their chance of long-term unemployment. Yeah. You know, I think LinkedIn is for professionals in almost all categories, and one of the exceptions is academics. There may be other exceptions, but most professionals today. LinkedIn has become essentially a requirement, a place where employers who are considering you will look you up. Many companies report to using LinkedIn as the first source of first step in their recruiting process is to put in the candidate on LinkedIn and see who pops up. So I would advise job seekers to take LinkedIn very seriously, to put up a profile that is thoughtful, that conveys the best of who they are. Many job seekers I interview about LinkedIn express ambivalences, and rightly. So there are issues like your picture is right out there. And I've been talking about age discrimination. So people will say to me, why should I put my picture up there when age discrimination is so prevalent, right? I think that's a legitimate concern. On the other hand, not putting your picture means that the employer probably will skip right over the profile. we don't have great data on this. So this is one of those areas it's pretty new. We're trying to get a handle on the effect of LinkedIn on the job search. We know it's heavily used by recruiters. So we tell job seekers, get on LinkedIn. And I think I expect that it's going to help some, hurt others. It changes the nature of the hiring process to some extent, because instead of a resume, you have this profile with a picture, and then you have the Google resume, the other stuff that comes up when they are looking for you online, and this can also hurt some and help others. So the nature of hiring, the world of hiring is changing, and as researchers, we're trying to keep up with it and trying to understand the effects of it, but they are complex.
Good. We've completely run out of time. For alumni tuning in who wish to help, either help in the Institute of Career Transitions or find help, what would you advise?
Right. So first of all, we do have capacity as volunteers sign up to help job seekers to match you. So if you are in this position of being long-term unemployed, sign up or send me an email, and we will do our best to try to match you with support. If you're someone who you happen to be a career coach or counselor, you can volunteer to do that with us. But also, if you're someone that has ideas about how we can get more resources, we are becoming a nonprofit. We're trying to figure out how to get resources so that we can pay coaches. We are realizing that to scale this to the extent that's needed, we can't strictly rely on volunteer coaches and counselors. So we are starting to think about how do we get more resources to help support this nonprofit. And so, MIT alums, I expect some of you have some great ideas about this, and I would appreciate any advice.
Great. And I'll also put a plug in that this is the first co-sponsorship between Faculty Forum Online and the Career Lunch and Learn series that the Alumni Association will host monthly for those interested in thinking about their careers in general. And there's more information for that on alum.mit.edu. So thanks so much to Professor Ofer Sharone for joining us today. We encourage you to continue the discussion of these issues on our blog, Slice of MIT. If you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag MIT Faculty. You can also view an online archive of past Faculty Forum Onlines by visiting the Learn section of the alumni website. Please join us next month for another session of Faculty Forum Online. Thank you.
Thank you so much.